what do psychedelics do in the brain? How do they affect consciousness?
Well, those are two different questions. So we all know, well, have you had some psychedelic experiences?
I have had some psychedelic
Okay.
experiences, yes.
So if you've done it, then you know they can profoundly, within seconds, let's say if you're talking about 5-MeO-DMT, completely change your experience, profoundly change your experience. You can go to heaven, to hell, you can go anywhere in between, you can visit far out galaxies, you can dive down into the Mariana Trench and into to the depths of the earth. You can experience anything conceivable by human under appropriate, under various different types of psychedelics. You can lose yourself, particularly. You can completely lose your sense of self. So there are very powerful ways to transform your experience. And by the way, I think they're a good argument against functionalism because it's unclear whether this has any function whatsoever. You're sitting there with eyes closed, maybe for an hour, let's say under ayahuasca or something like that, have these profound, radical different experience of yourself and the world, yet you're just sitting there. Brain science tells us, to first order, there's a reduction in activity, very paradoxically, both in animals as well as in fMRI, in trained volunteers, and in EEG. So it's not clear quite. That was a very unexpected finding because most people, of course, have intense visuals. So you expect that visual cortex is highly active, but that does not seem to be the case. So it's a real puzzler. So at this point, we don't really know. And then, of course, they have this other effect. They looks like, particular, I think when you experience loss of self, they can have profound positive effect on mental health, right? So they're being tested for PTSD, for depression, and in fact, by the end of, before this year is out, the FDA, the American Drug Governing Authority, the Federal Drug Administration, will probably approve MDMA, aka ecstasy, for psychotherapy assisted MDMA for PTSD. And then the next year or the year thereafter, looks like they may approve it for psilocybin assisted psychotherapy for depression and major depressive disorders. So they can profoundly change your consciousness, and for many of us, they can have profound therapeutic long-term benefit.
Yeah.
But one shouldn't forget, Evan, they're very powerful tools, and like anything else, like any other tool, whether that's medicine or scientific, they can also have profound side effects, and they can also give rise to trauma. So one has to, it's not true that they will benefit everyone. And in fact,
Yeah.
what's probably going to happen once they get approved and there'll be millions of people trying it, will suddenly discover, oh, lots of people actually have horrible experiences, and these horrible experiences will stay with them for years at end. So one has to be careful. These are not substances to be lightly taken as just like, well, let's have a beer. It's definitely not the same.
Yeah.
Definitely, one has to approach them with much more caution. They're very powerful.
I can certainly appreciate that from my personal experiences with which have both been transformative and incredible, and on balance incredibly positive, but one or two quite negative circumstances
yes.
that I don't know if it's carried with me in any permanently negative sense, but it's definitely given me an appreciation for the power, and I don't openly just recommend them to people like I used to, because I had that experience where everything was lost, and it was an incredibly scary time. But on balance, I do think they have an incredible ability to transform. And the actual question on mental health, you touched on it, was my next one. What do you think the role of psychedelics will be in mental health therapies going forward? Say, even project forward into a decade. Where do you see psychedelic assisted therapies and things like this developing?
Well, so for the medium term, 5 to 10 years, I think they'll become very popular because they'll be approved in this country and probably very soon thereafter EMU in Europe, I don't know, in the UK probably as well, very quickly. Right now, there's still this general belief, following Michael Pollan's book and Netflix series and other still breathless articles, that they're going to radical transform mental care. But And it's interesting, if you look at the history of psychiatry over the last 100 years, that's always been the case. First, when there's some new cure around, people say, oh, this is going to change everything. And then, 20 years later, people realize, well, it works for some, wonderful, but for others it doesn't work. Or it may have, as we just talked about, it may have these negative side effects. And it's not going to be true that this one thing, this magic mushroom will solve all our existential problems.
Yeah, absolutely not.
So I think over the long term, we'll realize it's a very powerful tool that traditional societies, pre-Christian societies, or societies here in South America or Middle and in Mesoamerica discovered and used, but by the way, always in a social context, right? So I just came back from a long ceremony in Brazil. It's always together as a group. It's never sort of it's never sort of, it's never for recreation, right? For example, ayahuasca. No one does ayahuasca for recreation, but for therapeutic or for revelatory, for divination or for revelatory purposes. So, unlike, let's say, let's go out for dinner and have a nice bottle of red wine, psychedelics are very different. I think they're very powerful, and I think most people can profit, particularly going through an experience of loss of self, including possibly a near-death experience, because it can take away the fear of death. Many people report, including myself, it can totally remove the sting of death. So I think that's a powerful thing. Will it solve all existential problems? No, of course not.
Yeah. Would you mind? I'm very interested in this. Would you mind going through what was involved in the ceremony in Brazil? What's involved in that?
Yeah. So this is part of a church called the Santo Daime Church. So there are a number of the 3 different ayahuasca churches. So they were started in the early 20th century by effectively slaves, right, under the robber barons in Acre in Amazonia. Where you had this ruthless exploitation, and they started these churches, that sort of syncretic church combining Catholicism with shamanism. And part of that, so these ceremonies they last like 8 to 10, 12 hours, typically out in the rainforest or on the beach. And you get dressed in a particular way. You separate men and women on separate sides. Then there's a shaman there, there's a priest, a psychologist, a therapist, however you want to call him, who leads it. Then you sing. There's a lot of singing, Portuguese, English, a lot of singing, a lot of sort of dancing, swaying, a lot of drumming. So it's a very active manipulation of the environment. And as part of that, throughout the night, 3 different occasions, you drink the combination of the vine and the leaf that contains ayahuasca, among others. And then, very often it's associated with this purging, but they think of it as purging as a way to get rid of bad thoughts or bad affects. But it's certainly that it can be very harsh, and then it sends you on these visionary, spectacular or mystical experience. And typically this is repeated over 2-3 days, and then the next day again, to emphasize the social aspect, it's always sharing. So during the ceremony, you always stay together. You never go off by yourself. It's always part of this group. And next day, the entire group shares. You go around and everyone shares something about the experience. So again, it's very different from the classical therapeutic context in the West, where it's the therapist and the patient, the doctor and the patient. Here it's always a large group, and it's quite interesting what you can observe what partakes during these ceremonies, these Santo Daime ceremonies.
Yeah, absolutely. I know it's very personal, but would you mind sharing something that you've experienced and personally felt during one of these ceremonies?
Yeah, one experience that I can talk about was on the beach at midnight, and the main effect had already worn off, and then I was. It's still difficult to put into words. I lost myself. I was sitting there in half lotus and totally lost sense of self, a sense of the environment, and encountered what felt like a universal consciousness. Huxley described it in his book, The Doors of Perception, Mind at Large. That's exactly how it felt. I felt like I encountered a universal, that everything was mental, and I encountered this universal consciousness, which was universal, underlying everything, was not very differentiated. It was really a profound experience.
Sounds like it.
Which then made me question, as I said, then I moved towards more idealism. I reread my Arthur Schopenhauer, because he talks about, Schopenhauer is a classical case of idealism. It's now being revived, known as analytical idealism, where the argument is that fundamentally everything arises out of what he called will, which is a pure consciousness. It's relatively simple. It's more like an instinct. We know this in our own life. We always want something, and once we've achieved it, we are satiated for 5 or 10 minutes, and then again we want more. We always want more. And sort of he generalized this to everything. There's the laws of physics or the laws of biology. They always want something, gravitational attraction or eating or sex or whatever the case may be, without there ever being an end to it. And he envisions that as sort of this cosmic consciousness that underlies everything, and it manifests itself in matter as we see, matter, brains, stars, automobiles, that follows their own law that we can study with science, but underlying all these physical states are ultimately these mental states.
It's truly
there are now
incredible.
modern philosophers like Bernardo Kastrup in Holland who are advocating for this, what Kastrup calls analytical idealism.
How would you best describe what's actually happening in the brain when you have one of those transcendent, the world unified, everything is just, how would you best describe what's actually happening in the brain there?
Okay, so we don't know, because what we've never done, it's experimentally very difficult. I'd want to look at your brain only in that minute when you have that experience, that mystical, not the 1 hour before or not the 1 hour afterwards. But right now we have, typically what happened, you volunteer do their magic mushroom, you stick them for 2 hours in a magnet, where they have all sorts of experience, including no experience whatsoever, or being bored, or nothing is happening yet, right? You average over all of that, so that's pretty useless. What you really want to know exactly during that moment of pure mystical experience, where you feel you are now part of the universe, because it may well be that's what I suspect, that your activity in your brain goes almost away. It's a quiet brain. It's a brain where you're not asleep, so you don't get delta waves, but you're not conscious of yourself or pain or pleasure, so there isn't high gamma activity. So to me, it seems to be a brain where the activity is at a lull, a very quiet, a silent brain. And then you may be able, during this silent brain, you may be able to access these extraordinary, in the true sense of the word, extraordinary, different from ordinary reality, extraordinary states of consciousness.
Dr. Christoph Koch, what an absolute legend. I really enjoyed my conversation with him, and I hope you enjoyed that clip. If you did, then I couldn't recommend more you check out our full hour-long conversation you can get right now here.